Good morning, everyone. My name is Edson Tandoc Jr. I'm a professor here at the WKWSCI School of Communication and Information, and also the director of the Center for Information Integrity and the Internet, or InCube. In October last year, we started what we call our AI and the Media discussion series, where in October we talked about journalism practice, in the age of AI, where we invited some of our journalists and editors in Singapore, and also we have one guest from the United States. This installment, our second round of our AI and the Media discussion series, focuses on journalism still, but now we're looking at journalism studies, research, and teaching. So how do we study, how do we teach journalism? And I'm very thrilled that you can all join us this morning, and also that we have three excellent speakers who will share their thoughts about this topic today. So in the first round, each of our speakers will give a 15-minute talk, about their thoughts on the topic, and that will be followed by a panel discussion where I will get to ask questions and you also will get to ask questions. So if there's anything that you think about while they are talking in front, start noting them down, and you get to ask your questions after the three presentations. Okay. So the first presentation will come from Dr. Annika Sehl. Annika is professor and chair of journalism studies with a focus on media structures and society at the Catholic University of Eichstätt, Ingolstadt, Germany. So she's also a research associate of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford in the UK. Her research focus is on communication studies and journalism studies, in particular on public service media, digital change, journalism and social conflicts, participation in journalism, as well as norms and values. So you can see there's a lot of research there, and usually her research is with an international focus. So she teaches journalism, but she's also doing research on journalism. So Annika, please.
Thanks so much, Edson, for the introduction, and good morning to everyone. I'm happy to speak to you today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion later. So in my presentation, it has three parts. I'd like to speak first about AI and journalism practice, in other words, then about AI and education, and finally about AI and research. And my fellow speakers, Volker Hanusch, will then speak about more in detail about the research part, and Warren will then also speak in more detail about journalism practice. So this is pretty much an overview, and I like to point out the opportunities that come with AI, and I think those are probably pretty obvious, because very often we have an innovation bias. So when there's a new technology, we are happy to embrace, and that's good, the opportunities. But I also like to talk about risks and challenges, because I believe it's very important that we also reflect those in order to come to a responsible use of new technologies, and also about perspectives finally. So these are is the outline and the three parts, as I said. But first of all, what is AI actually? So when we talk about AI today, it's often a synonym for ChatGPT, but that's actually very narrow. So basically, AI is a collection of ideas, technologies, and techniques that relate to computer system capacity to, as Dickens Alof of the BBC describes it, perform tasks normally required human intelligence. Brennan and colleagues, for example, say. So when we talk about AI, this is a very broad term, in other words, an umbrella term, as Beckett puts it, always accepting that it refers to a portmanteau of related technologies driven by algorithms. These can be programmed as machine learning or automation. They may be manifested as tools such as bots. So that's the broad definition of AI. So and when we talk about generative AI, the actual creation of content, then it's a technology that can create new content, like, for example, text, videos, images, other media, based on always the training data. So that's a very important variable in the whole process, and it's written in response to prompts usually. So generative AI is just one part when we talk about AI. But this is obviously the part that today is most often the most relevant and interesting part to people. So first, as I said, I'll be talking about journalism practice. So what has AI changed in journalism practice? Actually, it can change or has already changed quite a lot, because AI can play a role on basically all steps of the news production process. So it's not only the production process and generation of text or images. So it can already start as a news gathering process. So when we are thinking about how are topics actually collected, how are topics found that are later reported, that can come up from topics trend analysis, anticipation of news events and scenarios based on AI. Also, the news production process then actually is the most obvious one in the automated writing of articles, but also data analysis, visualization, and so on. News verification, it can play a role in real-time fact-checking. And then also on the last stage, the distribution stage, when we, for example, talk about algorithmic distribution of news content and personalization on social media sites, for example, but also user engagement analysis, automated content postings, and so forth and so on, and also in the moderation when it comes to the follow-up communication in online comments, for example. However, these opportunities, as I already said in the beginning, they come also with challenges. And there's a number of challenges I believe are important to understand to then come to solution how to best integrate artificial intelligence in the newsroom. There's a risk of an uncritical adoption of that might lead to misinformation or also a bias of information, because that's the answer that the AI can deliver is always based on the data set that it is based on, and depending on what's in the data set, the answer will look like that the artificial intelligence can deliver. There's also fear of losing journalistic autonomy, ethical concerns regarding transparency and accountability. On the one hand, the AI may help journalists to actually delegate routine tasks where they otherwise need to spend a lot of time with, and they could invest that time in other obligations or tasks that are helpful for journalism, but it could also risk a job loss in journalism on the risky side. When it comes to content, we see a discussion that AI might be limited in capturing human emotions in a more nuanced storytelling, or also misinterpret things like sarcasm. And finally, authors also point out that it might lead to digital exclusion, more social polarization, threats to editorial independence, and algorithmic gatekeeping, or also platform dependencies when one platform becomes very, very powerful in delivering these AI tools and is mostly used. So I'd like to argue for a responsible use of AI in the newsroom that includes, for example, transparency guidelines. Many news organizations already have those in place nowadays or are working on them, meaning that they have a clear guideline on how to use AI, for example, for content creation, and be transparent in this regard, also to the public. Ethical training of journalists, on the AI capabilities, but also even more important, also on, or as important, on the limitations and risks. And also there's arguments for the human oversight to ensure quality and integration. So in that sense, using AI as a first step, but then in the second step, also have a human oversight that also can guarantee accountability then when a human looks and checks the text, for example, produced by an artificial intelligence. Another option could be the establishment of AI task forces. So what is an AI task force? Basically, it's a group that consists of journalists on the one hand and technical personal experts on the other hand, and they together, they can actually, when there is a new AI tool on the market, they can check it and can discuss where are actually opportunities but also pitfalls for journalistic work, and then can communicate that to the newsrooms so that new AI tools can be best used. And similarly, the experimentation and hands-on approaches, so when there are new tools, to encourage the newsrooms to actually experiment with them to see where are actually the opportunities and where are limitations, and to find solutions to properly use those tools. Then when it comes to journalistic education, which is obviously a topic that most of you will be concerned with, maybe becoming a journalist later on in your life, But it's also for journalists, of course, already on the job. They also have to learn these new tools for their professional life. And so it's important to have workshops and practical hands-on training on these AI tools on the one side. But I think it's also wider, that the integration at universities of AI lessons or even modules in the journalism curriculum, they can go farther. And for example, on the research side, also integrate courses like AI for content analysis. So while we had like manual content analysis, we still have that, but we only had that in the past. Nowadays, we also have an automated content analysis. We have more large language model content analysis nowadays as well. So it also can enrich how we learn actually methods in journalism studies today. As I said, I will come back to that later on. But I think it's equally important to not only learn the technical skills, but also always integrate ethical considerations, because I feel universities are really a place where it is also about reflection of journalistic production and how to best use it. So, where we sum up the concerns and opportunities for journalism education or education in more general, we can see that's an opportunity in developing new skills, for example, to generate new ideas. So for example, when you do some research for an article, it might help you to come up with new aspects to that topic, or for what you do at university in general. You can be maybe more efficient because the AI is doing some of the tasks that otherwise would be time consuming for you. You can incorporate the data or even improve your writing, which might be a point even more for non-native speakers. So there's a lot on the opportunity side, but also concerns, again, on the ethics, a lack of skills. You might not learn the skills anymore that are also necessary to be able to, as a human, to conduct yourself. It might lead to cheating when you're not transparent how the AI is actually used, and then it can also be unfair, because in some ways universities also, well, examinations and a fairness system. It can lead to problems possibly in accuracy. I think this is also a lot of areas where research is still needed and can be very relevant, interesting in the coming years to see whether things like accuracy or diversity, how much the algorithm can help to guarantee that and be maybe more precise or more diverse than we as humans have been in the past, or where there's also problematic aspects. And in the end, also deflation of students. So if it is seen that all the work is basically done by the machine, this can also lead to that. So finally, I'd like to argue for more interdisciplinary educational approaches, meaning to combine computer science with ethics in AI courses. In the best way, maybe also bring together students from computer science with students from communication or journalism studies to work together on problems and find solutions together, but always integrating the two aspects. And also, of course, artificial intelligence and also courses about artificial intelligence offer potential for a remote learning, possibly also a personalized learning, and in that sense being itself AI, with open educational resources. Challenges in teaching obviously also includes to teach AI to non-technical students, so it needs a different approach to teach that needs to be kept in mind. I just brought like a very few. You probably also have from your own experience some examples of how to teach AI in mind. These are just some thoughts I found in literature. So for example, how to teach or how to make students aware of what is going on in the newsrooms when it comes to AI. A colleague has suggested that students can also do expert interviews in the newsroom. So doing research interviews basically can also be part of a research project. How, for example, journalists in Singapore are already using AI. What are their reflections about that? But also in a more practical, journalistic way to produce a podcast exploring AI's role in journalism, or also what the audience thinks about it. There can be collaboration with media organizations, also for like real world applications, so really the development in cooperation with the university. But also, for example, use of AI for brainstorming, as I said, when it comes to topic, use of AI in writing intensive courses, also with reflection on possible biases this can cause. comparisons to compare your human written text first and then let the AI write the same text to see where are actually the challenges, where are the risks, what is different, who is actually better. And might also be something interesting, or they have been done in the past, experiments also with the audience, whether the audience can see that this is generated by an AI. And the use of AI tools in production for things like removing background noises. So it might have already saved one or two of your interviews, and that's quite useful actually. So finally, journalism research. Obviously, AI in journalism can also be analyzed in research in the various parts. It can be analyzed, the influence it has on the profession, like how it has changed working condition, workflows, kind of what aspects journalists concentrate on, things like job loss, etc., possibly job loss. The content, as I already gave some examples, but also functions and business models of journalists. So there are many areas where research also still needs to be conducted. Research has already been done also on data journalism and pattern recognition, but also analyzing AI's impact on journalistic autonomy and ethics, I think is a very important part, and not at least the research on audience attitudes towards the generated AI in journalism to see how much does that affect, for example, things like trust of the audience in journalism, which is obviously core. So briefly and not very surprisingly, when we have a look at research on AI in journalism, this is kind of a systematic review done. Number of articles published between 2015 and 2023, so almost 10 years. Unsurprisingly, this has gone up. So research always reflects also the developments we see in media practice and in society in more general, and it's like easy to guess that it will go further up. Finally, as a meta perspective, use of AI in journalism research projects, as I've already anticipated in the beginning, automated content analysis has been now in use for a long time. Supervised machine learning was then a little bit later introduced. And here's also some potential of artificial intelligence with the large language models now that can be used for automated content analysis. And even ChatGPT, and the advantage here is that it can be used and require minimal technical skills. In that sense, is more accessible and cost efficient. And like some research already indicates that it can do relatively well in some coding tasks, and in some cases, achieves results that are comparable to human coders. So there are still limitations with that, but there might be some potential to get, without a lot of technical skills, some automation done in the future that we'll have to see is more comparable to human coders. So finally, to wrap this up, future directions, there's a need, from my perspective, for continuous adaptation in journalism, education, and research, but also a need to emphasize on critical engagement with this AI societal impacts, and to understand how to responsibly use the AI for the best of society and also across different media systems. And I think key to that is the collaboration also between academia, the industry, and also the policymakers that have an influence on that. So AI is obviously transforming journalism at the various levels. And I like to argue that a very balanced approach is needed to actually harness the opportunities, but also mitigate risks that come with it. Ongoing research and education are key to a responsible AI integration. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Annika. I think that it's some of you here are undergraduate students, right? So, learning about how you should develop yourself as a journalist, alongside the existence of these AI tools, that's one thing. But we also have our PhD students here who are doing research, so AI as a research subject, but also maybe as a tool as we conduct our research. So these are some of the things that I think Annika has already started to talk about. And we'll talk more about it when we now go to our second speaker. So our second speaker is Professor Volker Hanusch. He is a professor of journalism in the Department of Communication and Vice Dean for Career Development and International Affairs. So, we're talking about future careers, but there's also he's an international guest. So I think that both keywords are there. And he's doing this in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Vienna in Austria. He has been editor-in-chief of Journalism Studies since 2018 and has co-edited the 3-volume International Encyclopedia of Journalism Studies, in which many of our journalism researchers in the school are using. He's also vice chair of the Rules of Journalism Study, which is the largest representative study of journalists globally, and his research interests include comparative journalism, lifestyle journalism, transformations of journalism, boundaries of journalism, and indigenous journalism. So lots of research about journalism. So, Volker?
Thank you very much, Edson. Thanks to the school, to the center for the invitation to be here and talk to you all today. My remarks are going to be sort of more reflections, I suppose, and hopefully not too random. I did try to get a little bit of structure into it. Very much from, I think, following on from Annika's talk now at the end about how are we using AI in research, rather than what are we researching in relation to AI. But of course there are intersections there. But before that, though, it's sort of one of I think important for me to point out some preliminary words around my position in this. When I was asked to talk about AI, I was thinking, oh, okay. I'm not really an expert on AI because I'm what you would call a late adopter, I guess, right? So when everyone started talking about ChatGPT a couple of years ago, I think, or so, I was like, oh, okay. I started using it maybe 9 months after that for the first time. I never actually used it because I felt like it's not, and I'll come back to this time and again. I think it's around original thought. It's about original activities, and it's about, I was kind of like thinking it's sort of cheating in a way if we're using these sort of technologies, but also because I guess I'm a skeptic, and I always try, I think also in research, to not necessarily jump on the bandwagon every time, because of course we have in journalism studies, like I guess in every discipline, something new comes along, something exciting, a new technology in particular, in our field, everyone jumps on the bandwagon and we all research it, and then I'm thinking, well, there are already so many excellent people, brilliant people doing work on this, that it's sort of getting a bit of a crowded space perhaps. And also because I think we have a tendency in our field to think that every new thing revolutionizes everything. So we have a certain technological determinism in our field that has gone through, the age when Twitter first came around and everyone started researching Twitter and thinking this changes everything. Now AI will change everything, and no doubt it'll change a lot and already has. But I think it's also always really important to keep in mind the historical trajectory of how these tools have developed, because we sometimes tend to forget more easily what has been before, and how technologies, new technologies, some of the things that they change and do not change, may also have roots in processes that go back maybe decades. Just one of the things that came to mind when Annika was talking around some of the sort of data journalism that's now being done, all these computational things. Well, when I was studying journalism, and I started studying journalism in the late 90s, everyone was talking about computer-assisted reporting. And, people using Excel sheets in a very basic way to start to interpret data. Of course, nowadays, to anyone starting and studying journalism nowadays, that looks like Stone Age. But, there's a sort of there's a trajectory there, there's a history there of how a lot of these processes might have developed. And I think that's always really useful, just like with other technologies in journalism, even very basic media platforms, the evolution of newspapers, radio, TV, is important to bear in mind. But at the same time, I also realize increasingly how it is important to, while I may be someone who's skeptical of tools like ChatGPT, that everyone else is using it, and particularly students, of course. And it's a reality that at universities we are increasingly needing to deal with in terms of potential plagiarism, cheating, etc., all these kinds of issues. And it's something that a colleague of mine at my department in particular has been very much concerned with in recent years, and where earlier this, or late last year, she actually went through the trouble of checking assignments for one particular class and found out that there was about a third that looked like they had been generated with ChatGPT. And she called in all these students and did one-on-one interviews. And a lot of them just were very much blasé about it and did not think they had been doing anything wrong. And so it's about I think it's interesting also to try and actually get behind these motivations, to go understand why people are using it, what they're using it for, and what that may or may not help them with. So, but again, and I think in particular around that, because the other issue is that it's not just students doing it, it's also colleagues doing it, and the danger or risk of, for me particularly as a journal editor, people generating manuscripts, entire journal submissions with AI, writing reviews with AI, and I'll come back to that point. Those are very concerning issues, of course, that we do have to somehow deal with going forward. And as I said just before, I think at the heart of all of that is original thought, and what is our interpretation in this day and age of original thought, and when does that stop? Where is the line here? And I think I don't have an answer on that necessarily. I could probably give you a provocative one just for the sake of it, but I think it's something that we will need to think about going forward. So in preparing this talk, of course, when you're not an expert on AI, what do? You ask ChatGPT. So I did ask ChatGPT, now that I've used it for about 2 months, and probably about 5 times in those 2 months, I'll be honest. I asked for some general promises or challenges and promises and challenges. And I think obviously, I can very much agree with a lot of these things that ChatGPT offered me. And I don't want to talk too much about the promises, because I think we've already seen them outlined in the earlier talk. And I do want to focus a little bit more on some of the challenges. Though, to also say that when I was going through these results that the AI gave me, I could, for almost every point, also see a counterpoint. Right? And I think it's about not just kind of like in anything, not just blindly accepting what the technology gives you, what the AI suggests, but to also really think about it and to say, okay, well, yes, it might frame this as a positive, but what is actually the negative side of it? Granted, the threats or challenges that it offered were also reasonable, right? So it's not like it was giving me a one-sided kind of thing and saying everything about AI is terrific and we should all be using it, right? But I think it's always important to think further about some of these issues. So, of course, enhanced research capabilities, improved mining, text mining, natural language processing. Annika already talked about content analysis, automating content analyses, sentiment analyses, all these sort of tools that are offered to analyze data in ways that we may not have been able to do so before, or at least in dimensions we may not have been able to do, right? So everyone talks about how we can now do all these large data sets and we basically scrape everything off the internet and analyze it all. Yes, that's great, but of course my counterpoint to that would also be, do we need to? Right? We used to say for a content analysis of newspaper content, okay, these were the old days when we had analog and everything, 2 weeks of content would give you a reasonably representative sample. Why then do we need to analyze every day for 2 years, right? So there also needs to be a rationale. There can be rationales, I'm not denying that, but of course there needs to be also further thought. Just because it's big and we can do it doesn't necessarily always mean we need to do it. Right? So I think there are some interesting aspects to some of these. Automation of routine tasks, well, of course, it can help you even write a literature review. But is that, we come back to the point of original thought. Getting the AI to collate everything that is there, particularly when we know that some of those things, I actually went through the exercise at one point, asking you to do a bit of a literature review on role orientations, which is sort of an area I happen to know a little bit about. And there was a lot of very superficial, partly wrong information that was collated. So sure, over time that may improve, but again, you actually need to know what you're talking about when you're interpreting this information. So it may sound easy, and we are questioning the value of asking students to write literature reviews as part of their assignments, because they can do it very easily with ChatGPT and potentially even make it hard for us to detect it. We probably can still tell at the moment, but maybe not in a couple of years. So that changes the whole educational context, of course, as well. But yes, you can personalize learning and teaching. Annika talked about that as well. You can tailor it to specific needs. That changes our role as educators, of course, as well. I'll come back to that in a second. And I do think where it's certainly helped, and technology in general has certainly helped, is for collaboration and interdisciplinary work, right? And obviously, as a comparative researcher, as someone who has colleagues in all parts of the world that is working with, this has been, incredible. And there are vast opportunities out there, of course, that can really make these processes of collaboration a lot easier. But let's talk about some of the challenges, right? Because, of course, it's easy to think that the technology, AI, solves all our problems, and to then be over-reliant on it. On these processes, they may have inbuilt biases in the algorithms. We know that algorithms are trained on specific data sets. Again, all that is in flux and it's improving. We had probably as recent, again, I'm not an expert, but as recent as a couple of years ago, we were still talking about, racial biases, etc., in algorithms. So there are all these problems associated with how we're training the AI to help us automate our data analysis, and we just have to be careful of those biases, and again have to recognize those. It's about critically appraising the information that we're receiving, understanding how the technology actually works. And I think with AI being so complex, one is maybe more likely to simply just accept it and say, okay, it's giving me great results, but without understanding the processes perhaps behind how the technology is actually pulling its information together. And then, as I said, resulting bias potentially in research outputs, with maybe AI relying on certain rankings of journals. It might be favoring certain kinds of methods, certain kinds of topics, certain foci in the field, and that can exacerbate research biases as well. Issues, of course, around transparency. So I've already talked about the students. It's also an issue with peer review. As I said, as a journal editor, we've had recently a couple of cases where there was a suggestion that a peer review was actually generated with ChatGPT or some kind of AI. Now, that's a crucial concern for our academic field of how we interact with each other and how we appraise each other's work, because when a submission is made to an academic journal, it's made confidentially. It's unpublished research. It should not get out there into the world. If you feed it into generative AI, it's out there, right? So it's actually a massive breach of ethical protocols, of journal guidelines, etc. But it's difficult to police, and it's difficult to tell whether a review has been generated with AI. There are detection tools, but they don't necessarily always work reliably, right? So these are really tricky. This is a really tricky territory. So not only the production of papers as well, right? And again, we haven't had a case, but I think there have been cases out there and they've been made public. But around the peer review process and how we engage with each other as well. Even the use of grammar and spelling checks. So I guess everyone would think using Word is pretty uncontroversial, and I think that's probably fine. But even using software that is somewhere linked to a cloud somewhere, and you don't know with what's happening with the data. So one of these cases we actually had was a reviewer saying they had used being very open about it, saying they had used a specific software to check for grammar and spelling and to make it nice because they weren't a native speaker. And they declared it on their review, so, very transparent, done all the right things, but we checked it with the journal publishers, and the ethics team actually said they would prefer people not to do that. So, because they don't know what happens with the data. If we don't know what happens with the information, because you're writing a review about a paper, so you might still be using information about this paper that then enters the public realm. And so these are all these really tiny, tricky issues that we are beginning to have to deal with in academic publishing that are changing the way we operate in some ways. And potentially too may, we want to go very hyperbolic, maybe threaten our academic employment in terms of who are we as teachers if the AI can do a better job? Do we still need to teach certain things? There might be an argument, it'll free us up, to do all this other great critical work, and we can leave all the basic instruction things to the academics. But actually, we know what typically happens with these arguments. The same argument they make for journalists, and they're saying, AI will make everyone's job a lot easier, and journalists will have time to spend on, the real work, and they'll have more time. Often it actually leads to redundancies and things like that. So again, there will potentially be, I think, changes in the way that we as academics, I think, also will be working and teaching. And I guess also the last point there around data privacy and security, I think that's also related to a bit about the sort of peer review process, in general about data that you have to store somewhere, and being very circumspect around what you do in terms of data security with confidential data, critical data, etc. So I think that's an ongoing concern, also an international issue these days. So what do we need? Or rather, what do we want? I think crucial, of course, are critical literacy skills. To understand these technologies, what is behind them, how do they work, to appraise them, and to do that at an early stage. So, in research classes at universities. I mean, ideally also have critical media literacy in schools already and everything, but as it pertains to the academic context, to research, those kind of things I think are really, really important. But maybe also we need to rethink our ethics and what is ethical, and at what stage is the use of Gen AI ethical, and when does it stop to be that? Because I do think the realities are forcing us to rethink in at least some ways, because I don't know that our models from 20 years ago, probably even a lot longer ago, will necessarily be viable in the current circumstances, and the future ones perhaps as well. But that, of course, I'm not here to say AI is the devil and we all need to, sort of do something else. There are meaningful opportunities. There are great opportunities for the incorporation of AI, but always with a critical eye. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Volker. So we now move to our final speaker for today. We've heard from professors and researchers, what they think about journalism, teaching, and research. Now we'll hear from someone who's been in the media industry, and he has mentored lots of journalists and media professionals. I think what he will have to say will be very useful for, especially for our students who are planning, wanting to become a media professional after university. So our next speaker is Mr. Warren Fernandez, who currently serves as a senior fellow in the Executive Deputy Chairman's Office at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, so our neighbor over at RSIS. And also concurrently, he serves as Director for Industry Engagement at COHA, so our own college. I think he just started in January, so he's very, very fresh here at NTU. Prior to this, he was a Chief Executive Officer for APAC at Edelman, which is a global communications firm where he worked closely with the Edelman Trust Institute based in New York to develop and communicate its Trust Barometer Index reports throughout the Asia-Pacific region. So there's some research in there as well. But for many, for most of us, we know him as a long-standing journalist and editor, having served as the editor-in-chief of the English, Malay, Tamil Media Group of the Singapore Press Holdings Group of newsrooms, and he also concurrently served as editor of the Straits Times for over a decade. And when he was there, he also basically led the shift of the Straits Times or the SPH from being a print-centric newsroom into a multimedia newsroom that it is now. So let's hear it from Warren.
Thank you, Professor Edson. It was a great honor to be invited to speak at this event today. I've come to WKWSCI School many times in my previous career to speak to journalists, to encourage many people to sign up as journalists. But it's been some years now since I've been here. And as Edson mentioned, I came to NTU about a month ago, and one of the first places I wanted to visit was the school. I met him and he said immediately, please come and do this. So first day, how do you say no? So I automatically said, okay, I will happily come and join all of you. But I'm very happy that I've done so because the topic today is so interesting and so vital. Like Professor Volker, I'm no expert in AI. At best, I can call myself a sort of eager student trying to sort of understand what is going on here. And the two learned professors have already touched on many of the things I wanted to say. So I think what is probably most useful is if I share with you a little bit of the work that I used to do as an editor and what is it we were doing when we were working with journalists, what were we hoping they would do and how we would help them succeed. And also maybe a little bit about what is it we were looking for when we were hiring people to be journalists or as an extension from that to be communicators. And maybe that might help inform the discussion about what should we be doing at a journalism, a communication school when we're dealing with this new phenomenon called AI. So let's start, as Annika has done also, try and understand what is it we're talking about when we talk about AI. It's not just ChatGPT and using it to improve our presentations like I've done with this to make it look beautiful. It is really, I think, epoch-changing technology. And if you look here, I quoted Henry Kissinger. You all know Henry Kissinger as this great statesman, one of the leading thinkers about geopolitics in the 20th century. And in his last few years, as you know, on this earth, when he was late in his 90s, he decided to write a book. But he decided to write a book about AI. So I asked myself, gosh, if I was in my 90s, I probably wouldn't be writing any books. And I probably wouldn't be writing any books about the latest new thing that's on the scene. So why did he choose to do it? And if you read the book, it becomes very clear that he was increasingly concerned about where is all of this going. Because in his mind, as he says, it is a new epoch in the sense of how we understand, how we make sense of what's going on in the world. Knowledge generally is, you and I have an idea, we go out, we test it, we gather information, and then through a human process, we decide this is the new store of knowledge, and it's constantly evolving. But in this new realm, we will be encountering knowledge that is created by non-human intelligence. And it will do it at such a scale and such a capacity that we might not be able to figure out how it got to those conclusions. And we will then have to judge, do I believe it or do I not? Is this true? Is it not true? And for someone like Henry Kissinger, it was especially interesting because of the military and security implications. So just the other day, we had a closed-door discussion at the RSIS across across the way about AI and technology and warfare. And one of the speakers said to us, you know, today warfare is all about drones. And you can send thousands of drones into the theater, find out what your enemy is doing. So Joe Biden could call Putin and say, this is what you're doing, I know, I've seen it, or such and such a time there's going to be an explosion in Moscow, because of all this information that they had been gathering. And the interpretation of that information is done via AI. Now, I agree with Annika, we want human input, we want human ethics to make those judgment calls. But we are also going to be in a position where the drones will give you the information, the AI will interpret it for you and say, this is your best course of action. Now, you want to insert the human value judgment into that process, but you may not have the time or facility to do that, because would you want to be the general who's sitting there mulling over what to do, knowing that your counterpart on the other side is probably getting the same information and decisions and suggestions from AI, and there you're holding on to the button saying, maybe I should think about this for the next 10 minutes, and kaboom, your history. So that is really the epoch that we're entering in, and I think for all of us it's important to understand not just what it means for journalism, but what it means for human knowledge, human understanding. Yuval Noah Harari, also one of the great thinkers of our times, and I think what he's saying similar things to what Kissinger is saying. It's important for us to understand how this is going to reshape our politics, our culture, our societies, and how it's going to shape everything. I agree with Volker, we shouldn't get into a panic. We shouldn't start saying that everything's going to change, but we need to understand that this is a new frame of dealing with the world. And the more we understand that, the more we can deal with it. Now, in this sort of situation where so much is happening, I think it's always good to have a compass, right? Help you figure out where's north, where's south, what's the direction of travel, how do I proceed, or do I step back? What should I really be doing? So I've tried to put my thoughts in this framework of north, south, east, and west. Essentially, I asked myself, if I was in Edson's shoes, and thank God I'm not, he can do it much better than I can, but if I was having to figure out what to do with a journalism program, how would I think about it? So this is a very rough and ready framework, which we can discuss in the Q&A. Essentially, I think what would be necessary for journalism students today to know, and I think Professor Annika has given you a very good schematic arrangement of all the stuff that you can do with AI, which is similar to the list I've got here. Content creation, analytics, monitoring the media, customization. One of my teams, when I was at Edelman, came up with a project for one of our clients, which was to customize content from an influencer across markets, across languages, across time zones, one influencer, and it could be replicated just through AI. And mind-blowing, customer loves it, willing to pay. You think about the fact that you're doing it. Of course, as a good agency, we would attribute, we would acknowledge, we would tell people, but there are many others out there who wouldn't bother to do all of that. So the downsides, as Professor Volker pointed out. And then you get all the further implications about what does this mean for dealing with fake news, misinformation and disinformation, which then becomes a societal challenge which folks like us in this room will have to grapple with to help shape and influence public opinion. So I won't go too much into this because I think my two learned professors before me have already touched on it quite a bit. But that is all sort of necessary information, basics. It's almost like journalism 101, right? When I started in journalism, it was T-line that we had to learn, which kind of dates me, right? Some of you probably don't even know what I'm talking about. It is squiggles you draw on a page to help you take notes. All of that's out the window. AI will be your journalism 101. And I used to say to new hires that joined us in the newsroom that when you come to us from a communication school, like the WKWSCI or Goldsmith or the two universities that our friends are from, you have a head start over your peers because you've got all the craft skills, you can plug and play, you can get up to speed very quickly to produce content and all your editors will love you. But that head start is limited. You maybe have a head start for a year or two because your peers who've come in from, I don't know, they've done PPE or government or history or chemistry or whatever, They will be behind you in the first instance, but the best mass comm students would be the ones who would continue to build on that head start by going deep into some area of expertise, whether it was history or sociology or economics. If you want to be a business journalist, can you write about business and link it up to previous business cycles? If you're going to write about the general election that's coming up here in Singapore, everyone's speculating about when, I don't know when, but we can all speculate. Can you link it up to previous electoral cycles and what changes in the outcome might mean? So that ability to go beyond the craft skill into deep knowledge, which could be any area which you are interested in, go deep. And that's why I think Professor Annika's point about interdisciplinary studies is such an important one. To be able to take the craft skills but link it up into some store, some body of knowledge where you are going to become the in-house expert when something happens. We used to have a journalist who was very interested in terrorism long before it became a topic. And every time an incident happened, we would all stand up, all the editors would stand up and say, where's that person? Get him or her to write about it because he knows a lot about this subject. So you want to become that person who has that depth. That will make you not just have the necessary, but also the sufficient skills to be a good journalist. Now, I know it's very easy to keep adding and adding and adding to the curriculum, right? And I often used to challenge my colleagues, okay, you're going to do X and you're going to do Y this year, and next year you're going to do Z. What are you going to stop doing? Because we all have only so much time, we all have only so much bandwidth, and you need to then pare it down to what is it that's essential for you to be a good journalist, a good communicator. And I think for where we are in the world today, these are some of the things I think you really have to have. That ability to think critically, to be skeptical, to judge for yourself, to be able to tell black from white and shades of gray. Then data skills, you need to be able to take the data and interpret it and crunch it so that you can make judgment calls yourself. Thirdly, I would say interview techniques. That's vital if you're going to be a good communicator. To ask the right questions, to be able to listen, to be able to ask the follow-up question, to be able to ask those questions in a way that makes the person that you are engaging with willing to continue talking, so you don't shut down the conversation. You see some of these BBC-style hard talk conversations where they're both shouting at each other. A lot of heat, very little light. Very little gets revealed in a process like that because it's antagonistic. But if you could engage a person and get him comfortable and build that rapport so that he's actually starting to tell you things he probably doesn't want to tell you, you become a far more interesting and useful journalist. And then lastly, the ability to understand society and understand people, what makes them tick. Because the AI will do all the technical skills, but the AI, not yet anyway, will not be able to understand human beings and what moves them and what motivates them and what will make them decide in non-rational ways the things that they want to do. And then lastly, I would say good journalism programs should also help build up that sense of wisdom. What I mean by that is, I know We School has had a long-standing tradition of sending journalists out into the world, far-flung corners of the world, to go and do real-life things, get experience, get your hands dirty, live in a tent rather than in a five-star hotel. The more we can get our journalism and communication students to do that and build up knowledge about the world, about being street smart. I mean, when we interview candidates for the newsroom, we're not looking at those with the best grades or the best schools that come up. We're really looking at, can this individual go out there and connect with another human being and get them to talk to him or her and tell their stories and connect with those stories and then communicate those stories in a way that will resonate with the audience. Because if you ask yourself, what is it you're doing as a journalist? You are essentially gathering all this information, whether it's about AI or another country or parts or a particular sector or particular industry. You're gathering all that information, mulling over it, and then linking it up with other interesting topics and then saying to the world, this is why this matters to you. And a good journalist can do that. I don't think the AI can do it yet, and long may that be so. But it's coming. It's this poor individual is sitting there very relaxed, thinking that the waves will lap at its feet. I think it's going to be a big wave. It's going to be a tsunami. We better start thinking about this. We better start thinking about the implications for all our lives, for our children, because the more we get on top of it, the more we can manage this technology and harness it to our advantage without sort of it going off at a tangent, and then we'll be on the back foot, the better we will be. If you look at all that's going on in the world today, right? I mean, every day you wake up and you see a new headline from Donald Trump. It is utterly amazing that with so much going on in the world, we are having a debate about tariffs, which is a 19th century debate. We're having a debate about countries wanting to take another country. If you think about it, a good journalist would be able to ask him all those questions by linking up to say, what do you mean when you say you're going to take this place? What do you mean when you say you're going to take Gaza and displace people? And explain to people what the implications of that is going to be. And I think that's what journalists are here for. That's why we are on this planet, and I ultimately still think of myself as a journalist. And I think if we can train a new generation of journalists to do all those important things, we will be making an important contribution to this new epoch that we're all entering. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Warren. I will now invite our speakers to sit and on the stage as we prepare for the question and answer round. You can start thinking about your questions, but hopefully so far I hope that what has been shared has been very helpful. Like what Volker mentioned, as a researcher as well. In the beginning, I also tried to steer away from AI. I knew everyone is going to do research about AI, but at the same time, like what Warren mentioned, it's a new epoch, right? And all these research that we do across different fields, I think are also important for us to really understand how we should navigate these changes that we are witnessing. Annika and Volker also talked about what should be the new ethical guidelines. Do we need new ethical guidelines? How would this look like in terms of really guiding what would be an acceptable use, of AI, especially in the context of the newsroom. So we're talking about journalism today, but this is not unique to journalism. Different media industries are being affected in similar but also very different ways, right? And so I think discussions like this are quite important for us to really understand how we should. Actually, if we say prepare, it's too late for preparation. I mean, AI is all around us. Our PhD students here have been involved in at least one project or more about AI, or thinking of pursuing research in terms of AI use and implications across different media industries. So we have lots of questions. We may not have the answers for you today, but I think we will start our discussion. So let me just sit there. So as your moderator today, I have the privilege of asking the first round of questions, but we have a microphone in front as well. If any of you think of anything while we're still discussing, just raise your hand, and Saurabh will bring the microphone to you so you can ask your questions. Okay? I think my first question would be maybe a bit broad, where every time we have a new technology, people think, oh, this would be an equalizer. People have said that about social media. Now with AI, some are saying, oh, if I can use it to translate or improve my writing, that would make things more equal for people. So if I'm not a native speaker, I can use it to tidy up my English. But what are your thoughts on this? Is this a tool that we can look at and say it will help make things more equal for students and researchers? Annika?
Oh, okay, can start. I think this is a very good question. So I think it's twofold here as well. As you said, you've given examples where it can actually help. But I think there's also the danger of the other side. The one thing is we can see that some groups in society are better in making use of new technologies than others. In that sense, it can also lead to a larger digital divide, actually, of people being more aware how, as a user, use it. But also, on the other hand, I think it can also lead to more inequality with the question of how to influence the AI. So organizations, groups that are more able, more motivated to feed in information into the database, by this influencing the response of the AI, this of course is also a huge imbalance and a way of influencing public discourse that is not necessarily a good way, as you have pointed out. So I think there's really both sides. It has potential of equalization, but there's also a huge other side to that.
So what I hear from that is I think both sides where there's, on one hand, it's about the users who are using it for, when we talk about Gen AI for generating their assignments or articles, but at the same time, it's also for the groups or institutions who might want their own agenda or perspectives to be showing up in all these AI-generated responses, and they might, some might have the resources or the capability to influence the training data. I think that's interesting. Warren?
Can I add? I mean, I think it's a tremendous tool that will help open up a lot of markets. Say, for example, I used to edit the Straits Times, right? And the Straits Times is in English, so you have the addressable audience is English-speaking Singapore. Okay, then from there you try to go into the region, and then maybe with the tools and technology you can go to the world. But with AI, you could have Straits Times content translated into Bahasa at a high quality, and then spreading. Automatically, your market becomes all of Southeast Asia. Previously, we used to look to Zhaopao for its understanding of what was going on in China, because they had deep knowledge and correspondence there. But because of language, it would take several days before you could translate all of it. With AI, you could do it instantly. And you could open up access to knowledge and information from any other news source without language being a barrier. Apart from language, news, can you imagine in Singapore, which is so multicultural, right? If you could take all the rich Malay and Chinese and other language plays and poems and translate it into English, suddenly your access to content becomes so much richer, especially in a country like ours. I would be able to read Chinese classics. My Mandarin is very bad at the moment, but imagine with AI, I could enjoy all of it firsthand. So the possibilities are endless, but there's always a flip side. Your adversaries can also do it to you, right? So competition becomes more intense, the opportunities for disinformation also plays out. So
that's interesting, because I remember when I was a PhD student, there are texts that were, or articles and books that were very much related to my research that were actually in German. So I was trying to use Google Translate to at least just make out what they were saying. But I think with AI, it's probably better now. So on one hand, it can help like researchers like me who want to access texts that are not in the languages that I understand. But at the same time, I mean, if you look at Google Scholar and how they rank search results, they still prioritize certain types of articles where mostly from particular context, maybe in the West, so that might also then disadvantage other researchers. So I think there's always like benefits and risks depending on how you're looking at it.
Yeah, and for fear of being the skeptic in the room again, or overly skeptic, I think we're all healthily skeptical. Some of these discussions take me back to the times when the internet emerged and everyone was saying, oh, this is going to be great, it's going to liberate everyone and we're going to have free access, everyone can talk to each other, modern coffee houses or, and public deliberation, and see where that goes 30 years later, right? And so one of the things I learned very early on from some esteemed colleagues at the time who were skeptical of these developments already at that time, was the role of corporates, and nothing comes for free, and there is going to be access issues around AI and the haves and the have-nots, and so I don't know how they will pan out. I mean, I think, of course, in the more affluent countries, it's relatively easy, but we're already seeing some, on the international scene, discussions around who's going to buy OpenAI, what's the role of DeepSeek, what's the role of, so state players, corporate players, I think are increasingly going to enter into this scheme because there's money to be made. And what will happen with that?
Can I engage on that? I mean, it's okay, right? Yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting because I was reading this book by Harari, right? He has this very interesting idea where he talks about the naive view about information. That the more information we put out there, the wiser we'll all become. And if there's doubt, just put out more information. So you can just build this bubble. But actually, you could be putting out more and more information which just confuses people, and then we don't get any the wiser. So I think that's a very Californian idea, that somehow we'll have freedom and everyone will suddenly become wise. But I think that the ethics that you're talking about is so important, right? Getting people to understand how to make judgments, how to interpret, that becomes so much more important in this day and age, because more doesn't necessarily lead to better understanding.
I think it's an important point Volker made by reflecting on the commercial influence of that, because it made me think about when we are talking not about the beginning of the internet, but about social media, and where we have seen now where also the downsides are of having the commercial players dominating that field. And we can see now a move towards a deplatformization. And for example, in Germany, where I'm from, there's now a huge discussion about whether there should be public value-oriented platforms as an alternative to those commercial platforms. This has been in discussion for long. It was always said, no, that does not make much sense because all the users are on the commercial platforms. But it seems there's now a moment in time where this could become more of an opportunity or more possible, actually. So I think it's not about AI as a technology as such, but also the question, what is the context in which this is embedded and in which this is used, actually?
I want to move it a bit more specific. I know we have lots of students in the audience. I mean, from your perspectives as someone in the industry and someone teaching and researching journalism, if I want a career in journalism, would you advise me to use AI now? Right?
I would say yes.
Yes?
I think you have to. I mean, you're not going to lose your job to AI. You're going to lose your job to someone who can use AI better, faster than you. So you need to have the ability to use it. But that's not going to be enough, right? You need to be able to use it, but also do the interdisciplinary studies, get your ethics right. I mean, if you are thinking about being a journalist, now's the time to really get your ethics right, get your values right. Because when you are a journalist, you have to make judgments about what do I believe, what's the value of this statement, what's the value of this video. I once had to, very early in the terrorism situation, I had to sit down and watch a video. It's the most horrible video I've ever watched in my life, of someone beheading another person. And I had to decide, do I run this video or do I not run this video? And how much of this video do I run? In that moment, you have 30 seconds, 60 seconds to decide. You cannot be sitting there philosophizing and moralizing about this. You have had to have sorted out your values way ahead of that situation. Now you're in university, this is the time to be understanding the ethics of all these big decisions you're going to have to make as a journalist. So use that time.
I think I very much agree with Warren. So I would say this is really, and this is what I also see the great value of journalism studies programs, where you learn both the research about journalism, but also the practical work in journalism, that you have to have the compass, I like that picture, about what is quality in journalism, what should good journalism look like. And then I would also encourage to actually explore AI tools, play around with that to see where it's actually, not necessarily play around with that when you want to publish it, but play around with it to try to learn what are the pitfalls, what are the limitations, and where can it also kind of complement maybe your work or help to improve the work. So yes, be aware of what's happening, but be even more aware of what quality in journalism is and how to produce a good journalism in the sense of that it's helpful for society.
Yeah, not too much to add other than perhaps to say that absolutely you should be learning how AI works, critically understand it. Should you be using AI to write your literature reviews? No.
I think I tell some of my students that, well, you need to write better than AI, because I think Warren talked about this before, where in our school, when we prepare our students to be really good writers, right, that is your advantage when you join the newsroom or any media company, that you have the craft skills. But anyone can also learn how to write, and if they're focused on it, they can catch up. I think you said you have that advantage for at least a year, but if you don't have the depth, for or domain expertise, right, that advantage then evens out. And those who have other things like domain expertise in politics, political science, or history, I think then it becomes their advantage. Because I was also thinking, if I teach news writing, and I think many of our students here, that's a basic news writing course, right? It's a very templatized type of writing. There is a structure, if you go with inverted pyramid and whatnot. So if there's any form of writing that can be done well with AI, it would be writing news, because would you agree? It's very templatized, right? But at the same time, then I think that if everyone uses AI to write your news articles, then at some point all news articles would read the same, right? Because we're feeding the machine with the same thing over and over again, and if we're happy with that template, then it becomes it makes everything look the same, which means if we do that, it's harder to stand out, in the field. So that's what I was thinking, that we need to try to write better than the AI, or what Annika mentioned, we use AI to experiment, where can we write news articles using a different format, I think there are studies that have shown that the inverted pyramid format is not really the best storytelling technique. It's more of a practical structure. When in the past, when we lay out on newspapers and we need to read the first few paragraphs so we don't have to flip through the inside pages. But now that most people read news on their phones, that way they can go through the whole thing. I think the inverted pyramid is no longer that of a practical need, right? We're not really hardwired to process narratives in that particular way.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. But I'm thinking, again, for me, a lot of that comes back to originality of thought, and the personal touch a little bit in the way. So, and I guess as academics, we're in a more luxurious position than journalists. I remember also as a journalist, having to turn things over very, very quickly, and you can't really think about your decisions and how you pursue the story. Yes, you are using templates. In academia, you have a little bit more time for your research, not as much as you used to either. It's also become a much more time-pressured environment. Journal articles are also somewhat templated. But I think, I don't know, and it's, for me, this is always a personal thing too, right? So I'm someone who still writes their own sign-off on their email. I could just template it and I have, all the best Volker in every email as a standard. But I just still kind of like writing it, even though it takes me a little bit more time. And so it's just one of those things about, not that the other person is necessarily going to know, right? But to me, yeah, it's about how I want to communicate and how I want to be still personal and be able to write something differently, maybe, which I might not if it was templated. And so it's the same, I think, when we write journalism, and we're afraid then of getting all the same stories, or if we write academic journal articles.
I think that's a very important point, that personal insight, that personal touch, right? Because you're thinking about news as inverted pyramid, right? A couple of days ago we had the budget, right? And I used to tell the newsroom when I was there, you are no longer writing just for tomorrow, you're writing for not just for today, but for now. And so that put a lot of pressure on them to write very quickly and fast and get the stuff out. But with AI, they won't have to do that. As the finance minister is speaking, the AI will put out the headlines to say $800 for every Singaporean or whatever. It will just go out without even human intervention, right? So then what does the journalist do? I think that's where that personal touch to say, what will I do with 800? What can you do with all these things?
that more human, that more interpretive content is going to become much, much more valuable from the human journalist, because the tools will do faster, quicker than anybody else can do.
I remember before when I was a reporter, I was in the we had a what we call it a press office, where in the beats some government agencies would have a room for just journalists covering that area to be in, and I observed one reporter where if there's a crime story, say theft, she would call her main office and say, can you email me the past stories about theft? And you would just like change the names and the amounts, so it's a very templatized. But you're right. Then you lose the human, the personal touch. You in a way you lose your creativity and also your voice as a journalist.
Yeah, but I think that's it can be balanced in a way that you have like very standardized routine tasks. Like if you take the stock exchange, just supporting the figures, it's very there's a template, and that can be also done in an automated way. However, I think it could free up resources in a branch that is really suffering from economic pressure, to have resources for exactly this, like real analysis done by a human, like real commentary, like real investigative reporting, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I think it's very important to think about what can also be done supported by the artificial intelligence, or even like mostly written, like if it's a very simple task like these, and where can then the human actually spend the time best to have an additional value, to have this personal writing perspective, opinion, and so on and so forth.
I mean, this is something that they've talked about, right? How like newspapers, since they're only publishing the following day, that they should now not think of their work as involving breaking stories, right? So basically repurposing what a newspaper is for, but I can see how what we're discussing also may apply to like how journalists see their work. A human journalist would see his or her work, right? Where, okay, if I'm earthquakes or movements in the stock exchange, that can be done by AI, right? Which means, I should not bother myself with breaking stories anymore, but more on making sense. Is that something that we should start telling our students, that you should focus more on more analytical pieces? I mean, there is still a need for breaking stories,
I
right?
think they have to be able to write also the breaking stories, of course.
I think yes, the breaking news will always be important because it is news, right? But then the interpretation, I mean, in the old days, everybody wanted a scoop, right? You publish, you save the scoops for the print product because it's the most important. I tried to shift the newsroom into saying, you still should have scoops, but your scoop is to get it out there first online, and then you own the space. Within minutes, someone else will rewrite your piece and add stuff, and then your scoop is gone, but you still own the fact that you got it out there. That was the original content. Through your thoughts, through your investigative journalism, you own that scoop. But it's a different idea of what a scoop or breaking news is. I think investigative journalism is something that will be with us for the longest time, because it's a human process of going out there, looking in the dark corners, shining a light on them, interpreting it. The AI is not going to do that unless one of us prompts it to.
I think that's the value actually of exclusivity in a way. So I would not see exclusivity as only positive, but if it's of course a topic that is valuable, relevant to society, it is. And so this cannot be easily done by AI. So this is really where you need the human power to, it can support to, for example, analyze in the data that you can also reach exclusivity. But I think this is really important, that you have something that is also distinctive in a way then, where you can add something to the discourse.
I want to maybe circle back again to this idea of our journalists. When we train them, we want them to at least have some depth, or expertise in a particular domain, more than just the craft skills. Are we seeing this shift in journalism curricula in some places, maybe in Vienna or in Munich, where, because for us in our school, if you look at our journalism electives, they're very much about skills, news writing, online news writing, photojournalism. So it's really teaching training our students how to do, how to write, how to produce, right? Is there a shift, or should there be a shift to then giving more political history, which will be already usually from another school? Here, I think our students are, encouraged to take electives here and there, but they're quite free to choose which electives they will take, which may not necessarily be about building a domain expertise.
For me, it's tricky to say because in Vienna we have a much more sort of research-oriented education. So we're not sort of a practical journalism school. There's a different type of university in Austria that does that. So they do very much hands-on and do a lot of the practical news writing. We do a little bit of that, but our students are sort of more kind of educated in the way of building critical skills and critical thinking, writing a lot more sort of research-based work. I mean, reflecting back on, I used to teach in Australia for a long time, and there it kind of also depended on the institution. So you could do a Bachelor of Journalism, which is very much just a lot of journalism courses, but if you could also combine it with another degree, and there you could specialise, and people were encouraged. And I think that's always been, at least the context that I've worked in, was been an important point driven home by news organisations as well, that they wanted those rounded individuals who didn't just know how to write a story. Yes, it's very important, but they also wanted them to have specialised in history, political science, etc., and have an additional degree potentially. So I think the best thing you could do back in the day was to do a dual degree and doing journalism and then specialising in something. I remember economics was one of those areas that no one knew anything about because it was not a popular course, because it had to do with numbers, and journalists didn't like numbers. So they were always encouraging people to do economics degrees, perhaps because they'd have a bit of an advantage over others. But so I think definitely I always have seen the point in that, and to try to offer students a more rounded education.
I think domain knowledge is incredibly important, and one of the things I did when I was president of World Editors Forum was we launched a program to train journalists in climate change communication. So to get them to understand, because I thought this is such a huge challenge, if we cannot communicate what is going on and why, how do people make sense of it? So we set up this program, lots of newsrooms signed up, it was over capacity. So I think if you can figure out a domain that you are interested in and go deep in it, you become a very useful person in the newsroom. After climate change, we had COVID, so we launched a program on science journalism, science communication. But I would say a good communication school would not only encourage you to do it within curriculum, it should also leave enough space in the day for folks to go out and pursue their own interests. So you don't crowd the program so much that there is no time to be exploring stuff outside your interests. One of the best climate change journalists that was, and I think still is in the newsroom in the Straits Times, was Audrey Tan. She was just passionate about this, and she would go deep into it. She signed up to do a master's program. She did Coresa courses, and we said, please do. And when she came to me and said, can you sponsor me to do this? We would be happy to do it, because she was building herself into an expert in the subject. And that makes you a very, very critical resource to any newsroom. Yeah.
Would you say that in the hiring process, I mean, you've hired lots of people in the newsroom, will that be an advantage if you see something that, okay, electives are in a certain area, or this is like, history, or would that be an advantage?
For sure. I mean, if you see someone who's got a deep interest in some area and has invested time and energy, that makes that person stand out, right? So at the hiring, it does. But in the opportunities that come in the newsroom to move ahead, to get advanced, right? If you remember the pandemic, one of the most credible journalists in Singapore was my old colleague Salma Khalik. And if she wrote about this vaccine or this protocol is useful, people would believe her. That was because she had covered healthcare through many, many ups and downs. She had seen health ministers come and go. And when she interviewed them, people knew that, yes, she's been doing this for a very long time. She understands the subject. She's seen past crises. She's someone we can believe. So that credibility comes from domain knowledge, it's sticking with the subject for a long time, and then you build expertise, both within the newsroom and credibility in the eyes of your audience.
Yeah, I very much agree. I think domain knowledge is important at the university where I am now, and also at one university I've been before. Students were able to choose a subject area or for specialization or second subject like political science, but they can choose from a variety of subjects. So that's the one thing, but I think it's several things that are important. I think it is domain knowledge for sure, but I also think journalism studies knowledge, for example, to know about your audience, to learn how you can learn to get to know more about your audience if you are in the newsroom. Then it's of course the practical skills. This is very often what students are most interested in, but also to learn at the university. And this is not only journalism studies, of course, but I think especially there it's important to learn analytical and reflective skills, that you are able later on to really analyze the topics you are reporting about, and also reflect on the process of the content production, and this obviously also helps and comes with an ethical approach. So I think it's really a combination of different skills you should learn, and domain knowledge is one of those.
Yeah, I think that's to maybe segue that into the kind of research area as well. I think I was thinking about this before when I said, should you be using ChatGPT to write your literature review? No. And I'm still saying you shouldn't. Remember this. It's so important to read. And I think as a society, we are slowly, and I don't want to be fatalistic or anything, but we're reading less. I see it with my own kids, you know, who read so much less. And I see it with students who read so much less, with PhD students, because there are increased time pressures. You know, you have to, if you're doing a thesis by publication, you have to churn out journal articles. You know, you don't have the time to sit down for 4 or 5 years anymore to write a thesis, to write a monograph. And everyone is trying to shortcut then, of course, right? So you're using AI for summarizing the literature for you, but you haven't actually read that literature. Now, it might give you the important points that literature's talked about. I'm not necessarily saying it doesn't, but to read an entire journal article, you know, you also learn how an article is written. You learn the template. You know, it's just like I kept telling students when I was teaching practical journalism, you know, to write like a journalist, you got to read a lot of journalism, you know, because it's a template, invert a pyramid. I mean, it's not brain surgery, really, you know. And so I think that's a really important skill to have, and domain knowledge you can only achieve by reading deeply into your topic, and I think it applies across all these areas.
Can I add to the point about reading? Because I'm a great advocate of reading, because there was a study that's done recently. It's the equivalent of the PISA test. You know the PISA test about schools and what they're doing, but this is for adults. And it found, to my horror, that adult literacy in Singapore declines after the age of 35, and we fall below the OECD average. Now think about that. We all pride ourselves as being a highly literate society, able to be, you know, plug and play, but our literacy levels are going down, and we're even below the average of the OECD. That should cause shock and horror in every newsroom, every organization, every department involved with education. And if you ask yourself, why is this happening? It's precisely because we're not reading enough, but more so than that, we're not reading and we're not engaging on the issues. You know, so discussing it at forums like this with your friends and peers, and then maybe taking the next step, actually writing about it, because nothing shapes the mind better than actually having to put pen to paper, finger to actually think about what's happening. And that, if we don't hold it, it will atrophy like any muscle. Right? And if we allow that muscle to atrophy, think about the ability to be able to fend off all that misinformation that's coming at you, right? A president of a foreign country says, I have the right to take this land. And you read it and you think, oh yeah, maybe he does. But on what authority, for heaven's sake, right? So to me, I'm a great advocate. We've got to get our people to understand the value of reading and continuing to read deeply. And just one last point, sorry, the point about domain knowledge, I don't want to overstate it to say you just have to read deep in one area, because a very useful person in any organization is the one who can take any subject and then hunker down and just learn and understand it and then be able to explain it. There used to be a little cartoon that was in the newsroom where the journalist would take a dart and say, today I'm an expert in, and then you throw the dart and you hit something, right? So you're an expert in that. It's a joke, but actually that's one of the great skills of journalists. Today you may be covering health, tomorrow you go to a court case, the third day you go to a business, but as a good journalist, a well-trained journalist, you have the skill to sit down, learn, absorb a lot of information, and then crystallize what it means and help people understand. That is at the core of the journalist's skill. And it's a very useful skill to have for any job.
Yeah, that one I can very much relate. I remember when I was in my newsroom, we used to have a beat, so at least you have like a year or two to really specialize in a geographical area. But my newsroom also experimented with having a general reporter, so and that was me. I was the first one, and like 2 weeks I'm in the Senate. The following 2 weeks I'm in the Supreme Court, and in the Supreme Court, like the kinds of landmark decisions you're reading can be very different. You know, can be one hand like more marital issues, another one would be like land issues, or another one would be very political. So what I was looking forward to being a journalist, having a day that's not the same as any other. You know, it can be very unexpected. There's a lot of you write about different things. It's also became a challenge, because you're right. You have to be you need to know the background or the history or the context of so many different things and issues. So, Annika.
Yeah, I think I agree, and I think it very much also depends on what type of journalist you are. When you're a local journalist, for example, you need to have very broad knowledge. It does not mean that you cannot also specialize. But of course, you can be also a very specialized journalist for medical journalism, for example. However, I think we have seen in the recent part that there is, a tendency to have a lot of also cross-sectional, cross-topic reporting, people of different topic areas working together, which makes a lot of sense very often, I would say. So it's even if you're specialized in one area, you have to think your topics broader. So when you're a medical journalist or health journalist, also thinking about what societal or political implications and so on and so forth, economic implications does that have. So yes, I very much agree. It should go beyond your specialized area.
And definitely also the reading, like what Volker mentioned and Warren mentioned, because when I've seen some of my students, so thankfully they're not using ChatGPT to write while in my news writing class, but I would see them use it to summarize texts that they have to read for other courses, which I really think is, for me, even if I read journal articles or books that I've read many, many years ago, I would still discover new things or read them in a different light that could provoke, new research ideas, or maybe use this theory in a new, more novel way. So, and I'm also guilty. I don't read as many texts as I read before. Part of that is time, but now I think for younger people, there's just many non-text options if you want to be informed about the world, right? Very visual, very video-based. So I think reading. I think we must, and that's something that AI can discourage us from doing, because it's easy to just get summaries or just ask your query to, even with just voice-assisted software, right? So it can give me a background of this issue. You just tell ask Siri or Alexa to summarize it for you. I think any questions so far from the audience from what we're discussing? Because I'm gonna go ask our panelists also about I would say more conceptual, maybe even more normative question, where I've worked with a PhD student before, where he was beginning to think about who do we consider as an author, in the age of AI. If I prompt the machine and then I edit it, like, am I still the author? And that goes back into questions of originality, but also ownership, and also questions of accountability. Who is accountable for what is included in the article? But I think a closer question to us is, who then do we consider a journalist? Where if we from the worlds of journalism, I think that's something we've discussed with Volker, I think last night, where this has implications on who do we interview or who do we study. If we have a study about journalism or what journalists do, you have a definition of who a journalist based on income or activities, but now you have machines that can perform journalistic tasks, so I feel like that will also have implications on our definitions of our core concepts, right? Which will then affect, how we design our studies, Newsroom ethnographies, there was a time when journalism studies, the gold standard is a newsroom ethnography, where you go into the newsroom and observe physical journalists, observe their processes. But now, how do we observe, an algorithm just automatically generating an article based from numbers it's being fed, directly from certain servers and whatnot. So, I feel like even the core concepts, right, and then you've discussed in your presentations, we're beginning to rethink, Annika?
Yeah, so maybe like broadly on how do we study that? I think it's a problem we have occurred already when we were talking about social media. So coming back to that, that is mostly, we get some of the data, but it's also relying on cooperation of platforms. So it's mostly a black box, and it's very hard to study, but at the same time I think it's very, very relevant to study because it has such broad societal implication. It can influence the public discourse, public opinion quite a lot. So I think it's important to have a focus on that, and also to make sure that it is possible to get more insight.
Just you mentioning that just sort of took me back to think about a video I always show to students when I talk about technology and of the Chinese AI news anchors, which is something in Europe is a completely foreign concept, right? We're very technology sort of not rejecting, but very slowly accepting region, and and I sort of look at it, and I was just thinking, okay, so how do I do an interview with an AI news anchor about their work, right? And actually I could think of interesting ways of doing that potentially, but I do think there are some really important and interesting questions around authorship and who is a journalist and that we need to think through more going forward.
Because the implications are on our methods also, like, again, like observation studies and how would you observe if everything happens, within a machine, and we cannot. Can we interview an algorithm? Just feed it with questions. What is your role, as an AI journalist? I think.
I know of some people in the worlds of journalism study, if I understood it correctly at one point, where so we're doing representative surveys with journalists, and they were trying to, I think, train ChatGPT to replicate the results, or to kind of like do basically a survey through AI. And so there's really risky terrain also that we're entering there, because then on what kind of data, real world data, is that based? And again, I think most of us are still that sort of generation that we know the world from before a little bit, where maybe in 30, 40 years we're having very different discussions about that as well.
Which we've seen with social media as well, of how it's very different now from what it used to be, and how we thought it was gonna affect people. The democratizing, we thought about social media, and now we're dealing with tons of inaccurate information, and also being misused by those who have the capacity and the resources, to exploit these tools. I will now open the floor to questions from our audience. Any, or you're still like generating questions using, anything that you want to share, also reflecting on your own use of Gen AI tools. Anyone who wants to ask a question from any of our speakers? Okay, let's start with my students.
Thank you. Thank you, professors, for this beautiful session, actually. It's very interesting because I was wondering while the presentations were going on about the relativity of truth and relativity of information, especially in this political climate. Just to understand, what are your thoughts on one or two organizations or one or two countries having monopoly over this information, and how as journalists and how as students can we be more wary of this?
Well, I can start and say a little bit about. So I think I tried to touch this a little bit when I said it's very problematic that often like one platform gets a lot of power and there's a huge platform dependency. And as I said, we have seen this with social media platforms. Can be very problematic. So and there we have seen the move to a deplatformization. And to me, generally, I could imagine that we see like possibly similar developments for AI in the future, so that you do not have like one or two major players or major countries behind, but that it will lead to, to deplatformization possibly. Otherwise, it's true. It's there's a lot of power involved for those who own the platforms.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess it may be an extension of what I was saying before about corporate interests and state interests, right? Because I think these are going to be political issues going forward, but maybe in different ways. So my hunch is that, you know, one way you have the very sort of liberal, economically liberal countries, and say, let's say the US, UK, Australia and all that, where I think the approach to things like AI has been very much just free for all. You know, the biggest kind of person in the end wins, and we'll just give it to, you know, whoever's got the most resources, whoever's will be the most powerful, right? And then so there's an issue around that. I see in Europe a slightly different situation, and you know, particularly the German context perhaps, but maybe also Scandinavia, probably also France, where there's a much more awareness about the inequalities that come from that as a result, and where there might be more state intervention, because there's been more state intervention in media, of course, in that part of the world for some time, benevolent state intervention, right? So in a sense of subsidies, et cetera, but that there could be a way then in those markets to try to allow for more equality of access and all that. But it's, I don't know, I fear that, you know, the way this is going and what we've been seeing in the last few weeks or a couple of months will be an issue, very much a corporate concern that will become a concern for states and how they want to use that, and for international politics.
I agree. I think it's going to become more and more of a societal problem, because information can be weaponized and to spread disinformation, to steer public opinion, to shape electoral outcomes, right? And I think more and more states are starting to see this is a huge area of cyber warfare that's taking place. You don't have to launch a missile or troops into enemy territory. You can just take out their infrastructure if you don't have access to companies that are controlling these things. So I think as it gets more and more involved, more and more states are going to realize we have to do something. How to do it is the challenge, because you don't want to sort of kill the technology in the process, and you don't want the solution to become worse than the cure, right? Than the disease, the cure to be worse than the disease. So various countries are tinkering around. I think the Germans were the first to come up with a regime that was quite strict with the platforms, and if you don't do these, the sanctions are high enough to make them pay attention. Singapore has tried with its POFMA and so forth. So a lot of it is dependent on building up sufficient trust in the societal agencies, so that you know that when they act, they're going to act in the interest of the society and not for any political partisan advantage. So I think that's the critical issue. It's going to become, we will need to make it less of a wild, wild west where anything goes with systems and structures. But ultimately, I think we have agency. We can't just say it's all the platforms, parents can't say, oh, please pass a law to stop my child looking at the phone because I can't stop him. You have to intervene, you have to shape it. I listened to a podcast recently where a pastor in Ireland was advocating restrictions on kids having time in school with their phones. And he was saying that the reason you do it is not to stop your child going to the internet. The reason is to stop the internet coming to your child. And they are coming after your kid. You wouldn't leave your kid in a shopping center unattended so that anybody could walk up and kidnap him but you leave your kid alone in the internet so for anybody to send all kinds of information and play around with his mind. And if you look at mental health issues and how it's growing, increasing concern everywhere, I think it's something we have to be concerned about and think about how to deal with it.
Other questions?
Thank you so much for the wonderful discussions. I think that lots of thoughts have gone into organizing this symposium, and it's really insightful at this point. As of now, I think I'm directing my question to Mr. Fernandez, given that I come from the industry before becoming a PhD student with Prof Edson. My question would be in relation to, if you indulge me to slightly go tangent from the original topic of journalism, but more on the PR side. You draw quite a bit of parallels between what you have done in the newsroom versus your last role. I just wonder, there's a last role as the CEO of Edelman APAC. In terms of the role of a PR, a PR professional, do you see any parallels between the struggles, the key challenges, and perhaps also the opportunities where PR professionals can use AI in helping automate their work, but at the same time also provide very insightful thoughts, critical thinking, reflective pieces on how they can work with clients, corporate or otherwise, to shape brands and reputations?
Sure. Well, I mean, I used to work for Edelman, and Edelman is a big believer in the trust barometer, right? So we monitor, we try to study trust, and what helps you to build trust in the eyes of the audience, the community, the society over the long term, and what can undermine trust. So that was the basis on which we advise clients. Build up your store of trust and goodwill in good times, because the bad times will come inevitably, and by the time you need to dip into that store, it's too late to be building up. So how do you go about building that trust and maintaining credibility in people's eyes? So that, I think, is a big role where there's a lot of similarity between what you do in a newsroom and what you do in an agency. It's, helping people understand what's going on in the world and why they should trust you and your brand. Now, the use of AI, Edelman was quite, I think, forward-thinking in embracing AI. And we said to our colleagues, please use it, please experiment with it, learn how to make the most of this tool, but be honest and open and transparent with your colleagues, with your supervisors, and with your clients when you are using it. They need to know, and everything you do must be signed off by someone in the firm. So there would be that human checking process. And I think they're quite advanced in doing it, because, I mean, we talk about surveys. There are AI systems which can help you predict, if you do X based on historical reactions, this is the likely outcome. We're not saying it will happen, but it is a scenario in which you might have to respond. If you do Y, this is the likely outcome. And that's very useful to decision makers. If you're the CEO of a brand, okay, you want to do this, how would the public react? Okay, you have 3 scenarios. Not predictions, but scenarios. So it's useful in that sense that the AI tool can help you say, okay, I will take this decision knowing that that might be the outcome and how I might respond to it. Or if I think that's too high a price to pay, I will do this other action instead. So I think agencies can help organizations think through some of these possible reactions, possible outcomes, and then decide, knowing what I now know, do I still want to do it?
We have another question.
Thank you for your great presentations. I'm actually a PhD student of WKWSCI, and actually I'm very, my research interest lies in human AI interaction. And actually, I understand that AI has been widely used in newsrooms for translation or transcribing. But what I'm really interested is that how AI agents may be used or have some implications for news rooms. So currently we have ChatGPT or some other kind of general agents like Perplexity. Maybe you know about that. So some of my friends would just say, if I'm going to see some news, I just ask ChatGPT, what is news about what's the latest news for Trump? What is the latest news for U.S. election? So these general agents will just provide the information, and then so that you do not have to look at all of these other news medias. And then so my question is how the news institutions will cope with this situation because the audience may be just ask agents about this rather than just refer it to the news institutions. And another related question is that I'm just thinking, it's just imagine that if a news institution can create AI agents for audience engagement, what do you think are the most important thing you may do with this agent for audience engagement? Thank you.
I guess that's directed at me. I think it's already happening. So audience engagement, data analytics, newsrooms are already doing it. I used to have an app on my phone where wherever I was, I could look at and see who was reading what, how much time they were spending, was this article being shared, and if so, should we be doing more with it? And I used to use it as a tool so that even some of the articles which were not being so well read, but which I felt were incredibly important, I would still want to be doing. So that's where the human input comes in. So you don't cede your control over the editorialization function to the algorithm. I think that's very important for good newsrooms. The engagement part, I think, opens up lots of possibilities. Because as you and I know, these days, nobody sits back and says, you can't sit back and say, people are going to come to my platform and read only me. There's just so much out there. You have to be very active in pushing your content into the audience and using multiple ways to do it, whether it's the podcast or the email newsletter or getting them. And I think you just have to proliferate. So newsrooms which used to say, no, we only do online, or we don't do this, or we don't do that, I would say, forget about that. Your job is to get the content and push it out in as many ways possible, because then you have the slightest chance of getting through the noise. And because in the space out there, the noise to signal ratio is skewed in favor of noise. So you want your signal to get through, you have to push out more and more content. And I say this not only to newsrooms, I say this to brands as well. If you are a healthcare product, there's a lot of information about your product that's being put out by your competitors or whoever else, telling people about how this will work. And unless you're going upstream in the ecosystem and putting good information, there's a Gresham's law, right, where bad coins drive out the good. There's also a Gresham's law for information. The bad information will drive out the good. So you need to then move up that information ecosystem to populate it with good information so that you have a chance of getting through that noise. So the AI can help you with all those things. So I think part of a good journalism education would be also understanding how to use that data, that skills to push your content out to more people.
Yeah, absolutely. Just 2 points on that quickly. I think absolutely. I think the issue of, we know in research there's a news finds me phenomenon, right? Yeah. So that substantial amounts of people will just think, oh well, the news will find me. They don't necessarily seek it out so much anymore. They'll just consume their Instagram, TikTok, whatever, and they'll figure that something important happens, it'll find me, right? But I think the point about particularly also interpreting these AI tools like data analytics, and we both had a look at each other because we've done some research on that in the past. Even when I was doing that research 10 years ago, that was already very crucial. It was just coming in and journalists starting to try to understand what are we actually doing with this information, and to maintain that kind of human perspective, that critical perspective on it. So maybe just quickly one anecdote that's always stuck with me from an interview with a journalist that I did in Australia. That time was there, and it terrified me because it was a story about a house that had burnt down. It was a mother and I think 12 children who died. It was a massive tragedy. It was up in Cairns, so north of the country. It was a massive story everywhere. When it came out that this family was Aboriginal, the numbers went down, right? So all of a sudden people lost interest in the story. Now the risky thing with that, of course, is that a journalist will go, oh, see, all our stereotypes about Aboriginals and people having no interest in stories about Aborigines are true, so we won't cover these stories anymore. I mean, that would be fatal, right? And so we would lose so much of that important news gathering, storytelling, etc. And so it's so absolutely vital, I think, for me, because it really terrifies me now. If you really fall prey to just the numbers, what does that do to our society?
I think there's really a difference between being data informed and being data driven. And for being data informed in such a case that you are now telling when you see there are certain pieces you feel are relevant and important, and you see the numbers go down for unknown reasons or that are from the start not read well enough, but would be very important for people, you know, for the societal discourse. This data informed approach, I think, can help you what you can do that your story is performing actually better to reach a wider audience, to make sure that the important societal topics are communicated in a way that they really reach the audience. While with the purely data-driven approach, while you might be very successful to reach a high audience all the time, but there's a very high risk that you are losing your profile, that you're neglecting topics that are really relevant for the societal discourse. So I think this is a very important differentiation. I would not say that data is evil. It can be used in a good way when you try to understand what you can do as a journalist or as a newsroom to better communicate your topics to the audience, actually.
Question? Yes, I have a question about the ethics around framing in news stories. There are quite a few news outlets today with, it seems like, a political agenda, and actually the way they frame their news stories reflects that. And my question is, because AI gives, like you said, a lot of data on your audience and the sentiments, what they're interested in. So what is the ethics around framing of news stories? Let's say you're writing a news story and the salient issue in your view is a particular one, but because you know what the audience is interested in, you may want to frame it in a different way to highlight issues that the audience would be interested in. So how do you draw the line? How far do you go when you frame your news stories?
It's all interesting because I can see how that also has implications on if we use AI to generate articles. Definitely, I mean, we say that you cannot not frame an article. And for us, you know, I mean, even if inverted pyramid is templatized, it's an editorial decision to prioritize what is the most important aspect of a story and put that in the lead. But how is AI programmed, and how does it determine what is the most important? You know, because for human journalists, we have what is important might be based on what I think my audience would want to read, or based on what I think my editors would want to see in the copy, right? Or basically what personally for me is important and what would affect my audience directly. But I think your question is really about the ethics of framing it in a way that will attract the audience. All right.
So maybe I can try to say 2 points to that. So the first thing is, when you as a journalist write an article yourself and you use, because I was not exactly sure how you mean it, you use the AI to learn more about your audience firsthand. So you know maybe a little bit more about what aspects your audience is interested in, or what leaning your audience generally prefers. When there's a commentary, you know which comments are read more, something like that. So I would say that here it's really important to have your journalistic autonomy. Even if you know these things about your audience, this is what I mean by data informed. You can know of these things, but you as a journalist make a decision about how you frame your articles, what type of opinion you like to write. So it's just a background knowledge that you have and you use in an autonomous and responsible way. If you mean it in the way that the AI is actually writing an article, I think then we are at another problem, and that is that the AI is actually relying on the text corpus it is based on, and from that can develop certain frames. And it's a black box. You don't really know what the AI is based on to come up with these frames, and this is really a process you need to reflect as a journalist and be very critical about and act responsible.
I think it's problematic, this term framing, because it's very broad, and I'm not clear exactly how we're using it. Because, I mean, I used to give this example of a water cooler, right? You walk up to the water cooler and everybody's talking about the latest Netflix program they watched last night, and then you suddenly start talking about, oh, I went to this concert and it was a great piece by Beethoven, and everyone will look at you like, what are you talking about, right? Here we're talking about this, and there's a disconnect. So is that framing? Or is that finding a way to get the story you want to tell read or viewed or connect? It's human connection, right? So as a good journalist, you're trying to say, I have something important to tell you, but what is the way to get you to pay attention? That's framing, that's angling, right? So I think that's a skill which we should hone, and with or without AI, but at the same time not skew it so much to be manipulative and cite information selectively or misinterpret it just to get the audience. I think then you've gone astray. But you can't say that I'm a journalist, I just want to write this and everybody should see the wisdom of it and please read it. It's not going to work. Because as a professional journalist, remember, you are writing for an audience. You're not writing for your mother or father who will read you lovingly, right? But you are trying to communicate to the world why this is so important to you. And that, to me, is something that won't change with or without AI.
In some research, journalism scholars differentiate between what audiences want and what they need. They're not always compatible. And at the same time, there's also research that found that even news audiences, they're not really sure what they want. That sometimes you get surprised, you frame it in the way that it should be framed based on your own journalistic standards, and it might still get your audience attention. Yes, I think there's a lot of research that we underestimate, that think our audiences are only after, certain types of, soft stories, or that sensationalism actually appeals to audiences. But I think there's also anecdotes or experience from the newsroom where good reporting, excellent journalism actually is appreciated by audiences. I think there was one time I was, when BuzzFeed News was still around, I spoke with some of them, and they said that some of their best performing stories are long form articles. And we had the stereotype of BuzzFeed as targeting a young audience who only read charticles, and that they want short pieces, and they don't have the attention span to really go through in-depth, well-researched articles. But for them, they were surprised that some of their long-form pieces were actually doing well in terms of number of views, So
we even know from like a bit older research where everything was still more bundled that audiences also valued articles they were not exactly reading. So they might have focused more on certain parts of a newspaper, but they still expected to be maybe the complicated economic analysis still to be there, and valued that as part of the whole product. So it's a complicated whole product, I would say.
Yeah, even broader, we've talked to people, young people in their focus groups, where they don't really follow the news, but they want the news to be there.
Exactly.
Like they know that there are social functions of the news, but they don't personally follow the news, and therefore not support it with their eyeballs or even their subscriptions or payments. So I think that's a really interesting, irony, where you have a group of people who recognize that news is important, but for them personally, they don't attend to news. So it was interesting anyway. It's not about AI, but I think everything is about AI now. Any other last questions from our audience before we officially thank our speakers?
If not, thank you for everyone for coming, and let's give a big hand to our speakers for today.
Thank you.